A young nurse, alone in life, tired but strong. A millionaire, buried in silence, as if he had given up on life. And their paths crossed in a hospital room. This isn't just a story about care. It's the story of how words that one thought would never be heard changed another heart. Please don't forget to subscribe and like. Thank you. The silence of the night shift stretched under the cold lights of the hospital. The rhythmic beep of the monitors rang like an echo between life and death. Room 413 in the intensive care unit had been a forgotten space for months, with no one entering or leaving. The nurses would whisper about the man lying inside. Richard Hartman, tech billionaire. Before he fell into a coma, he was almost like a god. But now, he was just a body, motionless, silent, as quiet as his past. And it was young nurse Clara's duty to care for him that night. Clara, only 24, but the lines at the corners of her eyes showed that she carried more weight than her peers. Her mother was seriously ill. Her rent had been overdue for 3 months, and with her small salary, she was trying to survive and keep others alive. She quietly entered and glanced at Richard. He was the same, motionless, in a deep sleep. She picked up a bowl of warm water from the table, leaving a towel and sponge beside it. She was meticulous, because if one day her mother were in a coma, she would want her to be washed with the same care. As she gently wiped Richard's arm with a cloth, she murmured, "My mom wanted to look out the window for the first time today. I think," she saw a glimmer of hope. "Maybe one day you'll want to see it too, right?" Richard didn't respond. His eyelids didn't even twitch. But Clara didn't give up. For her, these moments were not just about care. They were a chance to pour her heart out. "You know, sometimes when I come here, I pray, just for one day, for you to open your eyes. Maybe talking to you is what keeps me going." She sighed. Silence could sometimes be so loud. Clara fixed her hair. She smiled to suppress her fatigue. The loneliness inside her lightened just a bit with every bath. She was always the one talking. Richard was always the one listening. But what Clara didn't know at that moment was this. She wasn't the only one speaking. Inside what she thought was silence, there was much more hidden. The sun had risen, but for Clara, the day hadn't started yet. Holding a coffee cup in her hands, she was taking a few minutes to breathe outside the hospital room. The sky was a clear blue, but her mind was clouded. Her mother had been running a fever all night, and by early morning, Clara had to leave her alone to go to the hospital. Her conscience was torn into 2 parts, one with her sick mother at home, the other with the unconscious man in room 413. Richard Hartman. His whole life had been written in newspapers, but no one knew the story inside his silence. Only Clara could maybe feel it, even if just a little. When she entered, the room was still the same. The soft hum of the ventilator, the steady beep of the heart monitor. Everything was familiar by now. Clara pulled her chair to the side of the bed. She took out an old photo from a small frame, a picture of Clara as a child with her mother. They were smiling. Life seemed easier back then. She placed the photo next to Richard's bedside and slowly began to speak. "My mom didn't recognize me today. For a moment, she called me Elena. She was our neighbor's daughter when I was little. I think everything in her brain is mixing up now, but I'm not angry with her. She still knows somewhere, deep inside, that she's my mom. I wonder, are you like that, Mr. Hartman? Are you still in there?" She opened the curtain, trying to break the coldness of the room. A soft beam of sunlight fell onto the edge of the bed. Clara held Richard's hand. His hand was cold, but for a moment, she thought it twitched. She glanced at him. No movement, just like usual. Or at least that's what Clara thought. She moved slowly to prepare for the bath. The water temperature was just right. Every movement was careful, because this care was no longer just a task for her. It had become a ritual, transformed into the love she carried inside. The same routine every day, warm water, soft cloth, a silent room, and an untold life. This time, her mind wandered back. She remembered the first day she started washing him. She remembered her fingers trembling. Back then, this man was just a file to her. Now, though, there was a silent bond between them, deeper than any connection she'd ever had with anyone. Have you ever feared losing your mother, Mr. Hartman? I live with that fear every day. I check every morning to see if she's still breathing. Maybe that's why I've formed such a connection with you. I feel like you're waiting for someone, too. Still no answer. But Clara was used to it. For her, this was deeper than any conversation could ever be. As she gently combed Richard's hair back, she paused for a moment. Her fingers traced the fine lines in his face, like traces of years lived. "You know, I've never fallen in love with anyone. There was never time. Maybe I couldn't trust anyone. But for some reason, I feel safe with you. It's a bit strange, isn't it?" She smiled. Then, almost shyly, she lowered her eyes, as if embarrassed by her own words. The hours passed. She added her notes to the duty file and recorded Richard's condition. Everything was stable. Nothing had changed. But deep inside, with every word she spoke, with every touch, Clara was leaving a mark on another consciousness. As Clara left the room, she didn't notice something. Richard's right thumb, barely, almost imperceptibly, twitched. But no one saw it. It wasn't time yet. The hospital building was as quiet as usual. People were waking up, machines were working, and life was continuing in some way. But Clara's life was standing still. That morning, she hadn't even had time to drink her coffee. Her mother had been unable to sleep all night, and Clara had been waiting helplessly by her bedside. Now, she was walking toward another bedside, to room 413. As soon as she opened the door, the silence inside pressed down on her. Richard was still lying there. His eyes were closed, his skin pale. His face still looked strong, but it was as if time had flowed around him, leaving him untouched. Clara entered and opened the curtain. Sunlight flooded the room. She prepared the water. The cloth in her hand dipped into the water with almost mechanical precision. She didn't really want to talk, but sometimes silence became too heavy to bear. My mom struggled this morning. For the first time, she looked into my eyes and didn't recognize me. In that moment, something fell inside me. A little piece. Her voice cracked. She squeezed the cloth in her hand. Her veins became more visible. Then, she began to wipe Richard's arm. She was careful, gentle, but determined. Then she noticed something. Richard's hand was a little warmer. She lifted her head. She couldn't understand. She was doing the same thing she did every day, but today, there was something different. A few seconds later, she glanced at him. Richard's eyelashes fluttered. Clara's heart stopped for a moment. She stared at him. She waited. And then, Richard opened his eyes. Slowly, hazy, struggling. But they were open. The cloth slipped from Clara's hand. Water droplets splashed onto the floor. The familiar rhythm of the room was shattered. She wanted to pull away, but couldn't take her eyes off Richard's gaze. The man moved his lips. With a cracked, weak whisper, he said something, "Don't go." Clara felt frozen in place. Her eyes widened. It felt like her heart had been pulled into her stomach. Richard spoke again, with great difficulty. His lips trembled. His voice was almost inaudible. "I heard everything." Clara's pupils quivered. Her chest tightened. Her throat went dry. She took a step back, leaned against the wall. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Her knees wobbled slightly. Then, it came to her, the doctor. She needed to do something. She quickly composed herself. She ran out of the room. She called for the on-duty doctor. 413. He's waking up. Richard Hartman opened his eyes. A group of doctors and nurses rushed toward the room. Clara stayed a few steps behind. She had her hands clasped together. She didn't enter. She couldn't. She leaned against the wall. She covered her face with her hands. Her eyes were full of tears. That night, when she got home and laid her head on her pillow, she couldn't close her eyes. She couldn't sleep. She just stared at the ceiling. Hours passed, but the voice inside her never stopped. "I heard everything." That sentence echoed in her mind. Richard hadn't just opened his eyes. He had listened to Clara's most intimate, most vulnerable self, with all its fragility. And now, Clara didn't know. What should she say? What should she feel? Days passed, but it felt like time had stopped inside Clara. The morning Richard opened his eyes was burned into her mind like a photograph. Every time she closed her eyes, his blurry, tired yet conscious gaze appeared, and the two words that slipped from his trembling lips echoed in her ears over and over. "I heard everything." Those words had burned and warmed Clara's heart at the same time. After the shock of that moment, she had fled, storming out of the room. She didn't know what she felt. Maybe she was ashamed. Maybe she felt vulnerable. Maybe for the first time, she couldn't bear the weight of being truly seen. And ever since that day, she had lived on, unsure of what to do next. For 3 days, she stayed by her mother's side, trying not to think about the hospital. But each time, her mind would return to that room, to 413, to the only listener in that silence. She couldn't sleep at night, tossing and turning in bed, sometimes staring at the ceiling until morning. When her mind would quiet, Richard's voice would resurface, growing clearer, deeper. Finally, she made her decision. Maybe she just wanted to see him. Was he really okay? Was he awake? Was he there? The questions that gnawed at Clara's insides were waiting for answers. And maybe a thank you, maybe a goodbye. That morning, as usual, was quiet, but there was a different heaviness in the air. It felt as though the sky had read Clara's mind and gathered clouds to share its gloom. Los Angeles was covered in a soft gray hue. Clara put on her usual clothes. As she gathered her hair, she looked at herself in the mirror, but she couldn't hide the dark circles from sleepless nights beneath her eyes. She tried to suppress the excitement inside her. "I'll just take a quick look," she told herself. "I just want to see." When she stepped into the hospital, it felt like returning to an old house after many years. Everything was in place, but something was missing. That day, she realized even familiar walls could look at you differently. As she walked through the corridors, her steps grew heavier. With every passing second, her heart raced a little faster. When she reached the intensive care unit, she held her breath. The familiar sounds of monitors, the dim fluorescent lights, the bodies wrapped in white sheets. And then, her eyes landed on room 413's door. She stopped in front of it. She reached for the handle and walked inside. And there was nothing. The room was empty. The bed was made. The sheets were tight. The windows open. The monitors removed. All that remained of the equipment were traces of wires. The curtains were drawn back, and the desk in the corner was empty. There was no old frame, no small lavender sachet Clara had once left behind. Everything had been wiped clean. Clara stood in the middle of the room. Her eyes were vacant. It was as if someone had ripped the inside out, leaving nothing but an empty shell behind. She had said so many things here. She had told him so much, without shame, without filters. She had expressed herself for the first time in this room, just as she was. And now, all those memories had been erased by a sterile emptiness. A voice came from behind her. It was a young nurse. "Mr. Hartman? He was discharged yesterday. He was sent home with a special team. He's doing well. His consciousness is clear. His treatment will continue at home under supervision." Clara slightly tilted her head. She walked away without saying thank you. Her voice was gone. Her eyes welled up, but she didn't cry. Maybe she didn't have the strength to cry anymore. The days passed like that. Clara continued working, but her soul always felt incomplete. At night, she began seeing Richard in her dreams. Sometimes he was still in a coma. Sometimes he was smiling at her, and other times he was lost in an endless silence, never waking up. When she woke, her pillow was wet. She felt like there was an empty chair inside her, but she couldn't name it. She knew one thing for sure. Something had been left unfinished. One evening, as the sky darkened, it slowly turned to rain. Light droplets began to fall silently to the ground. Clara had finished her shift. She put on her coat and slung her bag over her shoulder. She was about to leave the hospital. She felt a connection between the weight inside her and the rain outside. Silent, intimate, as if they were speaking the same language. Just as she was heading toward the door, a voice from the reception caught her attention. "Excuse me, is Nurse Clara here?" Clara Walker. The moment she heard it, something stirred in her veins. She froze at the sound. She didn't turn around. She just listened. Her heart began to beat. It was just a possibility, but she recognized the voice. "Clara, please, I'm looking for her. Is Nurse Clara here?" In that instant, the words slowed, and the world grew silent. Only that voice remained in the air. The voice she had known, the voice that had echoed in her mind for days. "Richard." Clara said nothing. She began walking. Her feet carried her outside. Her breath was shallow. She slipped her hands into her pockets and looked away. She stepped out of the hospital, and the rain had started coming down harder. Her hair got wet, and her shoulders trembled. She started walking quickly down the sidewalk. Her heart seemed to beat faster with each step. She didn't know what she felt, but she didn't want to stop. And then, a voice echoed from behind her, loud but fragile, familiar yet trembling. "Clara, stop." Her feet froze. The rain was soaking her face. Her heart fell into an empty space. The voice came again. "Please, Clara, stop." Slowly, she turned around. Richard was there. He was standing at the hospital door. He wore a gray trench coat, and held a thin cane. He looked tired, but he was standing tall. His face was pale, but his eyes, they were the eyes of a man who had found Clara. And for the first time, Richard was truly seeing her. And Clara, for the first time, she didn't want to run away. Rain trickled down Clara's hair in delicate lines. Her coat had long since become soaked, but she was unaware of it. Richard's voice had cut through the wind and reached the center of her chest. Her shoulders shuddered, her breath mingled with the rain, and finally, she slowly turned around. Standing at the door was Richard, cane in hand, pale but standing tall. His eyes were locked onto Clara's. There was weariness in his posture, but determination in his expression. For a brief moment, it felt as if the rain had slowed around them. The noise of the crowd fell silent. The world seemed to revolve only around the two of them. Richard took a few steps forward. As he approached Clara, a fragile yet genuine smile appeared on his face. He carefully leaned on his cane and walked forward, but didn't stop. When he reached Clara, he paused for a moment. He looked deep into her eyes, and then he extended his arms towards her. Clara froze, not knowing what to do. Her heart was pounding wildly. After a brief moment of hesitation, she instinctively moved toward him. Richard embraced Clara under the rain. Not tightly, but real. A tired, wet, fragile embrace. A moment when healing began, when the heart was no longer alone. "I don't know you," Clara said, her voice trembling. "But at the same time, I feel like I know you so well." Richard pulled back a little, gazing into her eyes. His smile was bittersweet, but sincere. "Please," he said, "come with me. I just want to talk. I just want you to listen." Clara paused for a moment. There was no reason not to go. Her heart was speaking louder than her logic now. She slowly nodded, and they began walking together. They sat at a small cafe, a table by the window, with the street painted in a gray rain. The waiter brought hot tea. As Richard warmed his hands around the cup, they sat in silence for a while. Talking wasn't easy, but silence wasn't an option either. "When I was in a coma," Richard spoke slowly, "there was no such thing as time. It felt like I was in an endless darkness. But then, one day, I heard a voice. Soft, gentle, but firm. It was your voice. At first, I thought it was a dream. But then, I started hearing it more and more. What you said, your story, your mother, your life, your hopes. I heard it all. Every day, I waited for you. I didn't know when you'd come, but you always did. And when your voice came, I could find my way through the darkness." Clara looked away, staring at the steam rising from her cup. She gripped her hands tightly. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I never thought you'd hear." "I know," Richard nodded. "But I did. I heard everything. And it became the reason I survived. A stranger's voice became the most familiar thing to me." Clara's eyes welled up, but she tried to smile. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. After a brief silence, Richard's expression grew serious. His eyes deepened. "Because I can't lose you. I don't know what's happening right now, or what will happen. This isn't a confession. It's just a truth. You became my return to life. And I, at least, want to do something good for you." Clara was taken aback. "What do you mean?" Richard slowly placed his cup down on the table. He rested his cane on his knee. "Your mother," he said. "I know about her condition. If you'll let me, I want to do everything I can for her treatment. The best doctors, special care, whatever is needed. This is not just a thank you. It's a matter of meaning for me." Clara's throat tightened. She lowered her head. The confusion in her heart stilled for a moment. Tears gathered behind her eyelids, but didn't fall. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Richard didn't look away. His gaze stayed steady on Clara, unwavering and raw. There was no grandeur in his tone, no theatricality, just truth. A truth so quiet, it somehow roared between them. "Because you gave me everything," he said, voice low, almost a whisper, without even realizing it. "Every word, every moment you sat with me. You gave me life again. I never gave you anything in return. I had nothing to give. But now, I have a chance. And if you let me, I can at least do this." There was a pause. Clara lowered her eyes, her lashes fluttering like she was holding back something too fragile to name. She didn't speak. Not yet. She closed her eyes, slowly, letting herself feel the weight of the moment. The rain continued to fall softly against the windows, muffled in the background like a heartbeat. For once, her chest didn't feel tight. For once, her world wasn't tilting. Her heart felt still. balanced, safe. And then, with a breath so small it barely left her lips, she opened her eyes again and looked up at him. She gave the faintest of nods. "Okay," she said, her voice soft and steady. "For my mother, I accept." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of things neither of them could quite say yet. Richard didn't respond with words. He didn't need to. Instead, his eyes filled with tears, quiet, uncontrolled, unashamed. He lowered his head, as if bowing to the weight of her trust, of the promise that had just been born between them. His hands trembled slightly around the warm porcelain cup he held, the liquid inside rippling gently with the movement. He said nothing, because sometimes silence is the only thing honest enough. They both knew. That simple exchange, that quiet agreement, it was a beginning. Maybe it would turn into a quiet kind of friendship. Maybe it would settle into gratitude. Maybe, just maybe, it would grow into something else, something deeper. But that evening, under the gray sky and the soft hum of rain, two hearts, once adrift in their own separate oceans of loneliness, now stood side by side. Not touching, not rushing, just existing together for the very first time. And in that stillness, something began. Richard kept his word. The very next day, a private medical team arrived at Clara's modest home, a quiet little place tucked away in a working-class neighborhood, filled with the scent of tea and old books. The team, dressed in white uniforms and equipped with the best tools, handled Clara's fragile mother with the utmost care. Gently, respectfully, they lifted her onto a state-of-the-art stretcher and took her away, not to an ordinary facility, but to an ultra-luxurious private hospital nestled in the tranquil green folds of a mountain just outside the city. The building itself looked like something out of a dream. All glass walls and open spaces, flooded with warm natural light. Every room was spacious and serene, offering not only privacy but peace. Each patient had access to their own dedicated care staff, personal therapists, and world-class medical professionals. In terms of comfort, it wasn't just a hospital, it resembled a five-star retreat for healing. Clara had stood in the doorway of her mother's new room, speechless. For a moment, her breath caught in her throat. Seeing her mother lying in such comfort, being treated like someone of importance and dignity, filled her with a strange mix of emotions. There was relief, deep, almost overwhelming relief, but also something else. A subtle ache in her chest. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the fact that she had fought alone for so long, and now someone else was helping her carry the weight. Yet Richard never overstepped, never made it about himself. He didn't flaunt his resources or expect gratitude. He was simply there, quiet, present, reliable. During her mother's hospital visits, he rarely left Clara's side. He read every report, reviewed every medication, asked questions, took notes. He listened when the doctors spoke, and when Clara was too tired to think, he remembered everything for her. Sometimes, during therapy sessions, he would just sit silently by Clara's side, sharing the quiet moments, giving her strength without words. Weeks passed, and something unspoken began to take shape between them. A tenderness, a familiarity. Their conversations, once short and polite, stretched into long exchanges filled with laughter, with confessions, with silences that no longer felt awkward. Sometimes they didn't need to speak at all. A glance was enough. A half smile. A sigh. The air between them had changed. It had softened, deepened. Their hearts began to recognize one another. Slowly, quietly, they had stopped being strangers. And in that slowness, something honest had grown something rare. Then one day, in the golden hush of late afternoon, they found themselves walking through the hospital garden. The air was crisp, scented with the light perfume of blooming flowers. Leaves rustled in the trees above, and a warm breeze moved gently between them. Clara stopped walking. She turned to Richard, her voice low but certain. "You've changed." Richard didn't look at her right away. His eyes followed the patterns of sunlight dancing through the leaves, his voice quiet but steady. "You changed me," he replied. "But honestly, I met you long before you ever met me. In silence, through your voice, through your heart. You were my light when everything around me was dark. Without even seeing you, without touching you, I fell in love with you there." Clara took a step back, caught off guard. Her heart pounded suddenly, wild and loud in her chest. Her breath hitched, and yet she couldn't tear her eyes away from his. The sincerity in his gaze left no room for doubt. It was as if he'd waited a lifetime to say these words. Richard stepped closer, his tone unwavering. "I know you love me, Clara," he said. "I heard it. In every word you spoke when you thought no one was listening. I heard the hope in your voice, the pain, the strength. And over time, I couldn't help it. I fell in love with the sound of your soul, with the heart behind your voice. Before I even knew what you looked like." He paused, his voice softening. "You ran that day, when you realized I'd heard it all. But now, I'm standing here, and I want you to hear me back. My heart is still there. It never left." And just like that, Clara's walls, the ones she had built over years of pain and endurance, crumbled. All the emotions she had buried rose to the surface. Her eyes filled with tears, and they slipped down her cheeks like rain. Richard stepped forward. Gently, slowly, he reached out, giving her every chance to move away. She didn't. Their faces drew closer, and for the first time, their lips met. The kiss was quiet, tender, not rushed, not dramatic, but filled with everything that words had never been able to say. The wind stirred softly around them, rustling the trees. Somewhere in the distance, birds began to sing. Time stopped. There were no machines, no voices, no hospital, just two hearts that had found each other in the unlikeliest of places. And in that moment, Clara realized something simple and beautiful for the first time in her life. She wasn't alone. A connection born in silence, in a sterile hospital room where one spoke and the other couldn't respond, had finally turned into love. Life sometimes surprises us with a miracle at the most unexpected moments. Just like in the story of Clara and Richard. If this emotional journey has touched your heart, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to my channel for more stories like this. Leave a comment telling me how you feel. Maybe you'll be the inspiration for my next story. Click the bell icon to be the first to know about new videos. With your support, we grow and start anew with every story.